So I think, COVID has definitely impacted the symposium. We don't have as many people in the audience as we'd like, but we have some, and also some of our speakers have had to drop out. And one of them was on this panel. Archana Ram from Patagonia has COVID, so she's not able to come. But the good news is she's already committed to being a speaker for next year's symposium. So, of course, we want to make this an annual event. I'm Victoria Clayton. I'm with SoCal Science Writers. And I have with me here today Daniel Swain. He's from UCLA Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. He's joining us from Boulder, Colorado. And we'll have to learn why he is in Boulder, if it has anything to do with climate or anything like that. That would be interesting for us. I also have here Sean Anderson. Sean Anderson is chair and professor of environmental science and resource management program at Cal State Channel Islands in Camarillo. And next to him is Larry Abel. And he's a former auto designer for Ford and Volvo. And he's a board member of Bike Ventura, a nonprofit advocacy group promoting biking as transportation. So welcome, panelists, and thank you for joining us. Thank you so much. I would like to just start, we could read out these really long bios of each of you, because you each have these very lengthy bios we could go into, but that sort of washes over people. I would really just love to start, and I'll start with Dr. Swain, and I'd love just to have you tell us, what are you working on? What are you passionate about? What is your organization about? What is your primary interest?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me today. Sorry there have been some technical snafus this morning, but it seems like everything's going smoothly now. So I'm a climate scientist, and I currently work primarily with the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA, but I also have appointments at the National Center for Atmospheric Research here physically in Boulder, Colorado, as well as the Nature Conservancy of California. So I wear a few different hats these days in terms of the organizations that support me and the kinds of colleagues and interdisciplinary work I get to do, which is kind of unusual, actually. In the academic and in the physical science world, there aren't very many hybrid positions like the one I'm lucky enough to have right now. So it is something of an anomaly in the field, and we feel that it's working really well to be able to span some of these very different kinds of work and approaches to doing that work. So, but to just back up a little bit more, being a climate scientist means different things to different people. There are many different types of climate scientists. There are some folks who really focus on the carbon cycle. There are other folks who are essentially meteorologists. And then there's yet other folks who think about things from a systems perspective or a human or ecological perspective. I'm more on the physical science side of things. So I take the top-down approach to climate science, literally thinking about the atmosphere and extreme weather events in the context of a changing climate. So I like to joke that sometimes I'm a bit of a reformed meteorologist. But in practice, it actually is really useful to be thinking about climate change from a weather in aggregate perspective, because really that's one of the main reasons why it matters. We experiencing a shifting envelope of weather. Humans, ecosystems, human systems are all able to tolerate some amount of variance around typical conditions. But once you start getting outside of that observed and planned for and adapted to historic range, that's when we start to run into problems. So that's sort of my philosophy of embedding weather within climate change.
Great. Okay, and we'll definitely get back to talking about weather for sure. Let's hear from Dr. Anderson. You're at Cal State Channel Islands, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about your work.
Yeah, so I did my PhD at UCLA, so I'm coming back home a little bit right here. But so I'm trained as a marine biologist, so my background is in subtidal ecology, all that kind of good stuff. But in the last couple decades, I've come up onto land, so I've evolved slightly. And I work at the interface of conservation, management, all that kind of good stuff. But in particular, we, at my school, so we're a relatively small school. We didn't get fully accredited until 2008. We're in a formal mental hospital. So the joke is that we're still a mental hospital. And so we converted this mental hospital to an educational institution. And one of the big goals that both in our academic work, but also in our organization's work, is to try to be much more inclusive. So our populations represent a large chunk of the folks that historically have not been part of the conversation. Different income groups, different people from other parts of the country, et cetera, large proportion of veterans. And our program prepares students to go out and actually be some of the foot soldiers to deal with some of these problems that we're talking about. My program in particular focuses on the coastal zone, broadly writ. So we have a whole variety of programs and endeavors to sink our teeth into problems. Our general MO is to find an issue or ask communities what their problems are. They talk to us, and then we sort of sink our teeth into that issue and hold on for a long time. So for example, we have a long-term program in southern Louisiana, where we work on recovery of the human system and of the ecological system from, initially from Hurricane Katrina, but oil spills, et cetera. In general, we work at the interface of natural science, social science, and try to bring these two things, these two oftentimes disparate approaches together. So for example, we have created a new index of coastal health, sandy beach health, that merges geomorphology, ecological, socioeconomic values to create simple scores, so more dashboardy type of things as to how our sandy beach systems are functioning. We also try to use innovative group collaborations. So we work with oftentimes large groups of government and other groups to pull together, try to pull together unique data sets. So one project we're currently working on is looking at who uses these resources. So one of the first steps before we look at vulnerability, we want to know who's coming to the area, who's impacted. And so we're using things like cell phone data to look at the demography of folks that come to the coastal zone, how they utilize the coastal zone, stuff of that nature. So that's a long-winded answer. I'm talking professorially, okay. But a conservation biologist that works in the coastal zone broadly.
Yeah, and it's great to put that out there too, because you never know when people need sources. You know, they need to call you up and they need to talk to you. So we have a non-academic here also, Larry. Larry, pronouncing your last name, is it Abel or Abel?
Abele.
Abele, so I'm completely wrong.
Or number three. That's fine.
All right, so now we have that right. Larry Abele. Now tell us, you have a very interesting background, so give us a little bit about that.
I'll start off. My story is I grew up in Los Angeles in the 70s, and what I observed was pollution was the crisis at that time, and most people don't realize that today is the pollution and the air quality is 5 times better than it was in the 70s. And as a child riding bicycles, I had very unpleasant horizons of deep smog. And so as I got older, I decided to become a car designer to have some sort of impact, because I knew there was a better way through this. So I graduated at Pasadena College of Design and worked in Southern California. And Southern California studios are the satellite studios from the major companies that see that California is kind of a starting point of a lot of innovation and a lot of global trends. So with that, I've worked for Volvo for many years, which is a very ethical company. And in the last few years of working there, we were working on advanced autonomous systems, and that was very interesting. So then I retired, and at the time of retirement, I wanted to give back to the community, and I had a lot of experiences cycling in Sweden, and I realized that there's a big difference between the infrastructure that was in the Scandinavian countries with bicycles than there are in the US. So for the last 3 years, I've been on a journey to understand that and understand from the automotive industry, California has always been the leaders in catalytic converters adoption, unleaded gasoline, EV mandates for organizations, and even clean diesel. So why were we so far behind in bicycle infrastructure? Mm-hmm. So with that, I've volunteered for nonprofit bike institutions in Ventura, and now I'm on the board. And it's a fantastic organization. where we work in the disadvantaged areas, and we always will provide bicycle transportation for anyone that needs it. If you're not familiar with Ventura County, it's an agricultural community, and it is real for many people to use a bicycle as their primary transportation.
So you're providing the bikes for them free of charge, and you're also accepting donations, like donated bikes from the community too, and you're rehabbing the bikes, is that right?
Correct. It's a nonprofit that works similar to a Goodwill. People donate them, and volunteers come and we repair them, and we will never turn anyone away that needs bicycle transportation.
And you're advocating too for the community to be more bike-centric, is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I spend more time going to council meetings and committees to talk about how to build better bicycle infrastructure.
Great. And we want to know more about that too, and more about other groups that are doing that, because I know there are some. I want to move on to a question that I'll open up to a few of you, or anyone who wants to actually join in here. But the original description of this panel, which I didn't write, but I kind of took over, alluded to carbon neutrality as a myth. Since the panel is about accountability, I hope that we could talk about this a little bit. So I will just throw out a few ideas of how we might get a little conversation started. Should individuals be preoccupied with their carbon footprint, or is this just a way to keep us distracted and not focused on creating systemic changes? And what does this systemic change look like? So I know I had an interesting conversation with Dr. Anderson, yesterday. Over tacos, where he was telling me a little bit of the history of the whole idea of having a carbon footprint.
Yeah,
so, do you want to start off the conversation?
Sure. So carbon footprint is something we all hear about. I actually have projects where we've created carbon fin prints looking at seafood, the embodied energies and emissions associated with seafood supply. But the reality is, and very popular, all these things pop up all the time. The very first carbon footprint calculator popped on the scene in 2004, and it was a product of British Petroleum. It was a product of BP. And so they hired a PR firm and essentially created this approach and this advertising campaign for you to check what your footprint is. And to be sure, knowing our impact on the environment, our personal actions, personal behaviors, that's a useful thing. We can make some decisions there. We can direct our economic purchasing to things that we more support or not. But it's very clear that this approach was really about focusing on you, and focusing on you feeling bad and you feeling guilty, and getting in this headset of, oh my God, I'm such an evil person. I purchased a microfiber shirt as opposed to a cotton shirt. I should go to hell, kind of thing, as opposed to talking about the systemic, large-scale things. So, for example, we could do all this fantastic stuff about switching to buying organic cotton T-shirts or something of that nature, but the reality is, right, the more than half of our emissions are coming from our transportation, energy sectors, et cetera, and that's really where we need to have the focus. So not to say that there's no personal responsibility, but the idea of carbon footprints has unfortunately really put the focus on personal guilt and that type of stuff, as opposed to being an uplifting tool to have conversations as much. At least I think that's
okay.
the case.
Dr. Swain, do you want to talk about this at all, or do you have anything to add?
I strongly agree with what we just heard, which is that it is absolutely true that the idea of an individual person's carbon footprint is an oil industry construct. And why, might we ask? Is this something that the oil industry came up with? It's because it was essentially, and I think probably correctly, I think it was in some ways a clever gimmick on their part to really get people to focus on how difficult it was going to be to change things if we all were on our own. I think that was essentially the goal. And I think in many cases it's successful. But what I want to mention briefly is why it's a problematic framing and why we really do need to be thinking about this differently, mechanistically, which is to say that, it isn't realistic in many cases to ask people to reduce their individual carbon footprint to the point where if everybody did it, it would actually solve the problem. The point being, we don't have systems today that are currently in place that actually would enable us to solve the problem, even if everybody did as much as they reasonably could, or even if they took pretty significant individual sacrifices. And it's not because the problem is unsolvable, but it's because the systems that currently exist aren't designed to make it realistic for individuals to make good choices. So really what we need to be able to do is to redesign lots of societal systems, transportation, agriculture, energy generation. All of these things are very important, but redesign them such that it becomes almost trivially easy to make good choices, where there's actually a choice. Where there's actually the ability to make choices that are good for the environment, that are low in carbon. Because the reality is, for example, in Los Angeles today, if you're a low income family and you have to commute, most of the time you have to get in a vehicle, sit on the freeway to get to work. There really aren't, in a lot of cases. Now, yes, it's not along some corridors, there are good bus lines, there have been real investments in public transportation. But the reality is that as of right now, for a lot of folks out there, we're not there yet. And so that's just one very regional and specific example, but there are so many ways. Our food systems aren't designed to make it easy to make good choices. And so really, by focusing on the individual footprint and the impossibility of it and the need to make genuinely large sacrifices, it kind of misses the point that if we realign our systems in the right way, these don't have to be major sacrifices. In fact, they can be mundane choices, or even choices that are obvious because it's so much easier, cheaper, and more desirable to do things in a low carbon way if we design systems so that they can accommodate that.
That totally makes sense. Do you see any progress toward this? I mean, do you see much progress toward this in any way?
There is some, and I think we're making the most progress probably in the electricity sector so far. So sort of the lowest hanging fruit is renewable energy, which it makes sense to pursue that most aggressively at first, because it is probably the place where we can most quickly realign things in a direction that is low or no carbon. But the electricity sector is not all she wrote. There's a whole range of different types of systems that generate a large fraction of the greenhouse gas emissions that occur. So yes, there's electricity generation, but then there's agriculture, there's transportation, and there's industry. And we've been making less progress in those areas, and to the point where we really haven't bent the overall carbon curve yet, where it's essentially the rate of increase of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere is slowing, but it's still increasing at a rapid pace. And so, we're sort of at this point where we're recognizing that this is a real problem. There are signs of real action on a larger scale, but we haven't yet really done anywhere near what we're going to need to do to really get a handle on this.
And I would say that again, for context, I think Daniel's younger than we are, but we old guys were around in the 70s, right, when we had the oil crisis. And the quotes I remember as a young kid was, we can't do this right now. We can't get off oil right now. We need oil. It's going to take 40 years. I remember this thing quote. It's going to take about 40 years, 4 decades to get off this energy system, to have this transition that we're talking about here. And so it's 40 years, right? And I bring oil industry folks into my classes and have them talk to my students, and they usually begin with a video showing how a popular video from the American Petroleum Institute that shows a room, and the person gets up, wakes up out of bed, and then they say, if we didn't have oil, and all of a sudden their alarm clock dissolves, and they're brushing their teeth, and their toothbrush dissolves, and it's true, right? I mean, a lot of these substances we're using right now are petroleum based, but that's the world that we've created in these 40 years, right? So this notion of, well, we can't just quite do it yet because, we need more time. And to be sure, we can't spin on a dime. But these narratives of, yeah, we just can't, it's too hard, that's ridiculous, right? I mean that's just silly talk. And so I think making sure that we understand that we've had these conversations for quite some time. This isn't the first time we've had this rodeo discussion, and that is part of it. The other part is that almost everybody agrees with us, right? And too often, I find the general public seems to think that we're divided. We are not divided. So just in Santa Barbara, Ventura, Los Angeles counties, we've been doing polling for the last 15 years, and consistently, at least about 80% of the people we ask, everybody, old, young, rich, poor, everything, hey, do you think climate change is a serious thing we need to address right now? Yes, right. You don't get that feeling when you read some of the media coverage or see some of the media coverage. So most people see this as a challenge. Most people want to do something. We have these levers though that have not been pulled in certain industries.
Do big changes, though, only come when there's a cultural change? And does a cultural change only take place when it's the individual getting rid of his or her lawn, the individual deciding to bike instead of drive, or take an EV instead of, buy an EV instead of a fuel car or something like that?
Well, I'll take that. In the journey, for me, learning about bicycles and why they're so used so well in Scandinavian countries, I thought, well, maybe they're just, they're brighter people and this is what they do. but the reality is they were on the same path as the rest of Europe after the war to have more cars. But there was some terrible accidents with some children being killed in Netherlands. And the public got behind that. We don't want this to go. And they decided that we're going to have protected lanes to drive. And so, unfortunately, sometimes it's some disastrous thing that gets people really motivated, charged to change things.
Do you each agree, though, that it has to be like in the individual, deciding to get behind these efforts that will be the thing that will cause these systemic changes? Or, we know that we need the systemic changes to really, really do something. We know just me using my reusable, shopping bags and driving an EV isn't going to do it. But doesn't me doing that, though, isn't that the only thing that's probably going to, put enough pressure on industries and such to change and lawmakers? No.
I don't think that's the only. That can be powerful, but I don't think that's the only thing. I think one responsibility we have. So we heard about just recently about the LA County, some of their planning and stuff. So I think there's also a large role for us to be ready for when the crisis happens. Mm-hmm. So we might not have the political representation or whatever it is to enact the change that we'd like to see right now at this instant, but we do have to be ready, right? And we see this time and time again with oil spills and wildfires. When people are freaking out, they're more willing and open to hear alternative pathways. At those points in time, if they haven't been prepared with the stories, if they don't have the plans sort of on the shelf, or at least possible plans on the shelf, at those points, that's where we lose it. And so we oftentimes need a crisis to help push us over the edge, mm-hmm. but just having a crisis isn't enough, and I think just having the individual actions isn't necessarily enough.
Dr. Swain, I saw you shaking your head too, so.
Yeah, I would add to that, and the reason for this is essentially because even if everybody did absolutely everything from an individual action perspective that's on the list, it wouldn't solve the problem. So that tells us that while individual actions can be important from a social signaling perspective, there really does need to be systemic change before individual actions even matter to the extent that they're going to need to. And by means of another specific example, using the LA regional transportation case again, I wouldn't personally recommend that folks try and ride their bike down Wilshire Boulevard during rush hour. I don't think that's a good or safe or reasonable proposition. What I would recommend instead is that people really get actively involved in advocating that there need to be dedicated bike routes. There need to be alternatives, to realistic and safe and cheap and reasonable and accessible alternatives to the way things are currently done. So I would posit that, for better or for worse, it's mainly a political problem, a political action problem. And this is increasingly true about all elements of climate change. I mean, there's obviously still interesting physical science we need to do to understand regional changes and extremes and all the details. But at a macro scale, there's nothing is going to change at this point scientifically that's going to give us a significantly different understanding of the overall problem. The real issue is that it's a policy problem. And as we've just heard, there is actually pretty good alignment among people in a lot of different countries, including even the United States, where there's so much divisiveness and partisanship at the moment on a lot of these issues. And yet the public policy choices that are actually getting implemented do not reflect that general consensus across political party lines. So that's maybe a broader issue with the way democracy is working or isn't at the moment in the U.S. and in some other places. But I think that, and this is where I think individual actions can be incredibly powerful, is at a local and regional political scale. What we're seeing is that those are the places where things are really getting done, and things can change much faster at local to regional scales than they do at larger geopolitical scales. And so really, in terms of individual actions that really move the needle, I think increasingly they're sort of social activism and in politics. So getting involved, voting obviously is important, but of course that only gets you so far. So it's getting even more directly involved is really where a lot of I would say where the rubber meets the road, but these days maybe that's not the best analogy.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think also having those conversations. So a couple stories I think of when we talk about this. One was one of my neighbors on my street several years ago. Unfortunately, he passed away, but he was a great guy, gregarious guy, and I love our street that we live on. It's half conservative, half liberal. There's old people, young people, so it's a nice mix. I don't like being in a homogeneous place, and so he was always, when we moved in, I had a Prius, right? I have a Prius because I have cars for 1,000 years. But he's like, oh yeah, green guy moved into the neighborhood, right? And this guy was a single older gentleman that drove a Suburban everywhere. And so, always poking me and stuff. And so one day I'm driving up the hill and he flags me down and I pull over and he says, and he puts his hand, I roll the window down, he puts his hands on the thing and he goes, so how many miles per gallon you get to this? And I was like, well, back up when I was flatland, I was getting like 54 miles per gallon. Now I'm getting more like 47, 48. And then I was waiting for the punchline, right? Or the mocking thing that he would typically yell at me. And he went, yeah, and what is it powerful going up? And I'm like, what? And all of a sudden, this gentleman on his own accord, he was doing the economic whatever it was, and he was like, hey, here was an opportunity to have a conversation, right? And I think when we turn off, when we run to our camps, that's where the problem is. I think we have to continually talk about this, not demonize the other folks, but have that. And I think too often it seems like we get depressed and we feel like we can't make a difference. And so that's where all the communication stuff that you all are putting out is really, really key. I think that's essential.
Larry, also, I want to just take this opportunity to let you plug Sunset for All, because I think it ties into what we were a little bit talking about.
Oh, if you're not familiar with Sunset for All.
He's not involved with Sunset for All, but I just think this is a cool thing, and he told me about it. So it's related to bikes.
Well,
and
it's
activism.
It's activism in the city where a group of people got together and decided they wanted a bike lane in their community, and it's from downtown LA to I think the first metro station in Vermont or something like that, and they got together and just demanded that their community build what was called a protected bike lane, and they've just had a lot of impact. And the takeaway from that is that they approached it with talking to the businesses, getting them involved, and they've got it on the legislated, what do you call it, on the drawing board, I guess, to do that.
Great. I think that's pretty cool. There are some questions coming through Zoom. Unfortunately, something is going on here, and I can't see the question now. I don't know if there's anyone back there who could come up and fix this or get rid of this thing. Oh, there we go. Okay, good. Thank you. So I do want to ask this question. Jenny Dushek asked a question. She said, I would like to hear a discussion about net zero as a civic goal versus individual carbon footprint, which is pretty different. The idea that we can plan to offset emissions with carbon storage. That's what.
Yeah, I mean, so that's the carbon sequestration, the carbon banking is a little bit of a newer conversation relative to an older conversation that I've been involved with it, which is when we do a restoration, can we do ecosystem banking? So the same kind of idea. Can we sort of have a place where we have this well-functioning resource and then have our impacts over here? And so that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about, can we sequester some or to take some actions to take some of the carbon out of the atmosphere over here and then allow us to have some of our impacts over there. And so I think the first way to frame that question is to think about permanence, and if this activity is going to work, we need to have measures. A lot of the elected boards that I'm on, we are taking actions to try to have more sequestration and net zero in a community, but we don't often directly measure the actual carbon sequestered in that park or in that natural landscape or other activity. And so one of my concerns with some of the banking aspects of stuff is I just want to see the proof in the pudding. Conceptually, it seems to make sense, but are these offsets actually persisting over relevant time periods? And mostly what we have is we mostly have modeling efforts and measurements in a couple focal areas, but I'm constantly pushing for more quantification of that. And oftentimes we don't have that, so we're usually reliant on a model from the state or a model from whatever larger area to estimate that. So that's, I'd say, one of my first worries about some of those larger goals.
Anybody, Dr. Swain, do you want to weigh in, or do you?
Sure. Yeah, I might actually back up a little bit to the really big picture about what net zero means philosophically. The idea being that the atmosphere, from a physical perspective, only knows about the net increase in greenhouse gases. It doesn't actually know if you've put a bunch of greenhouse gases in and then removed an equal amount. So in other words, hypothetically, you could emit a ton of greenhouse gases and then somehow magically suck the same ton of greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, and it would solve the global warming problem, right? Mathematically, physically speaking. However, from a net zero is a real thing geophysically, biogeochemically speaking, or at least it could be. The question is, in practical terms, will it actually be what it's purported to be, or will all the bold claims that we hear actually become reality? And that's, I think, where things start to fall apart, where there's a lot of individual corporations, for example, or entities in different realms that are claiming to be net zero or aspiring to be net zero from a carbon perspective, whereas really what they're doing is not really working very hard on reducing the emissions side, but really trying to purchase what in some cases are dubious or low quality carbon credits. Meaning, and by dubious or low quality, I mean you may not really be sequestering the carbon that you say you are, for a variety of technical and practical reasons. One of the classic ones is folks who are saying that we need to plant more forests, monoculture forests in the desert or in these places where forests didn't used to be. Forests are great. I love forests. Forests are a really important part of the climate change question and the carbon sequestration question. But we can't plant forests out of climate change, for example, for a variety of reasons. And so really philosophically, technically, yes, it's a real thing. And we will have some ability in the future to remove some amount of carbon. But I suspect that we're overestimating, in general, our ability to take carbon back out of the atmosphere once we've put it in. So our efforts really do have to be 80, 90, 95% on the side of reducing and eventually bringing to zero emissions. But there might be, I think, the place where it's most plausible in the long run, the net zero does kind of make sense, is that last remaining 2, 5, 10% of emissions. Once you've been really successful and we've reduced our global carbon emissions by, say, 90% in some decades, that remaining pesky part, these technical industrial challenges where there aren't really any good substitutes, we might be able to just offset those. But the point being, we really have to get rid of almost everything else because we're not going to be able to scale up carbon sequestration to a level to just magically suck all the carbon out of the atmosphere that we're currently putting into it. And I think a lot of carbon schemes, a lot of net zero plans are structured as if that is actually going to be a possibility. And so I think that's where a lot of the concern exists. That's where there's a lot of greenwashing when it comes to net zero, because there is a lot of reliance on hypothetical non-existent technologies or low quality carbon credits that aren't really producing a net zero situation.
Yeah, so it's essentially a techno fix, right? And our society, especially our American society, we really seem to like these things historically, right? We keep doing what we're doing and just sort of take this other action, as opposed to rethinking about the system itself and redesigning it so it doesn't cause a problem in the first place, or as much of a problem. So I don't know if that answered her question.
She said fantastic, so I think it did. That's good. Okay, so I'm sad to say we're running short on time, so I'm going to ask one additional question and then maybe take a couple of questions. We have a question that came over via Zoom. So let me just ask this, and this has a few things involved in it. But so some scientists are chaining themselves to banks as a way to get people to listen. But you guys are all storytellers. You all have research and organization information to get out to the public. What have you learned being this deep into it that's effective, more effective than maybe, I don't see you chaining yourselves to banks or other things. Maybe you have, though. You could clarify that if you have. But what's effective for you? What's your general mood right now? Do you feel like, do you feel hope? Do you feel like there is a way to get the message out? And then also I'll just note that as journalists, we're damned if we do and damned if we don't. I mean, we're accused of fear-mongering all the time, and then on the other side of it, we're accused of not making people afraid enough about climate change. So we get a lot of blame for that. So do you have any tips for us as professional storytellers?
I drink a lot. I like to drink a lot, and I like to swear a lot, and I like to tell jokes a lot, and I like to sit down with folks that don't share the same opinions with me. And I think, and one, it's easy because I'm an old white dude and can sort of do that easier than many folks can. But that being authentic, I think, is really, really key. And I think one of the things that I've leaned into is calling a spade, right? And when we see some silly idea about carbon sequestration, I say, like, that's baloney, right? And that has given me some credibility in circles that maybe otherwise would hear what I do or see what I do and then not pay attention. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important to be able to communicate to these different folks and not to ostracize folks. And so that doesn't mean you can't not say the truth, but we're all on this journey together, and I think people really respond to authenticity mm-hmm. more than people that seem to have a particular agenda or whatever. And so my authenticity as a scientist is to help people understand the truth. For me to try to understand what's going on, but then also to try to help other people see the facts as they are. And it's gotten harder in this era, this maelstrom of misinformation
mm-hmm.
that is floating around. But I think being personable and being authentic helps crack some of that insanity.
Are journalists pissing you off for not doing a good enough job?
No, but I think sometimes journalists are boring. I think sometimes. Okay. I mean, we want to be objective, and I'm a scientist as well. I mean, scientists are the classic boring people. I mean, are you kidding me? Like, why would you hang out with a scientist? Right?
Super boring.
But yeah, totally. But I think, but you don't have to be. I think people expect those types of things, and when you're authentic and genuine, I think that seems to really break down some of their assumptions, and then they seem to be more willing to hear you out and engage and actually really listen to you at that point. Okay. I think. I don't know about you.
Larry, you have anything to add?
I think my response now is to really focus on my local community and feel like I can have some impact. Working for a global corporation, you are always overwhelmed that we have to do these big changes to help. But for me, I feel that now working in the local communities, I do have impact and I do see change. And according to Bicycles, there is a kind of a national momentum to improve things. And just talking to people in the community, you learn simple things like everyone would like to ride their bicycles more, but they're simply just they have fear of riding through traffic. So I feel the work that I'm doing into improving our bicycle infrastructure, coming from a background from Volvo where safety is everything, and as we've talked about, complete streets is an important movement that's happening in this country. So that's my way.
We did talk about complete streets last night. Do you want to tell just briefly what complete streets are?
Yeah, I mentioned it. Yeah. If I were to say anything to journalists, I would really like you to promote and talk about complete streets. It's something that's going on nationally, and it's about reclaiming the street landscape to not be dominant cars, but to make safety for pedestrians, bicyclists, and public transportation. And the coming from, it's similar to in the 1970s when we had the ADA, as active disability,
American Disability
Act. Yeah, and how when we were younger, we didn't see the cutouts in the streets, and now they're synonymous everywhere. So I feel the complete streets will be that next movement in the next 20 years.
So more reporting on complete streets and more community activism, you think, is
yes.
For you, that was the solution, at least the community activism. Okay, Dr. Swain, are you mad at journalists for not doing a good enough job? Do you have any tips for us if you are?
Well, actually, I work with journalists a lot on a pretty regular and sustained basis, so I'm not the most objective person, but I actually think that journalists and scientists share some challenges, and in the sense that I think authenticity is really important, I think, in both spheres, and truth-telling does actually involve taking sides sometimes, and I think that's where there sometimes is a disconnect, both in science and I feel also journalism, where there's a bit of a parallel there, where there's so much pressure on scientists and journalists to eschew even the semblance of any sort of personal opinion in things. And I think that's increasingly a mistake, because it magically pretends that scientists and journalists are completely divorced from society and are non-human entities without personal opinions or viewpoints. And really, I think it's entirely appropriate to opine on things that you are personally and professionally an expert in. I mean, what better to offer your opinion on than the thing that you devoted your life to doing and studying and understanding deeply. So I think that there should be more. That doesn't necessarily mean chaining yourself to a bank, but it does mean, rather than pretending that we have total objectivity, which I don't really think exists anyway, is being really upfront about who you are, what your views are, and why you have those views, and in the appropriate context, voicing those, because I think, we're long past the point of pretending that scientists are just these completely inanimate objects in white lab coats. I've never worn a lab coat except in chemistry class, but that's a whole nother story. But I think you get what I'm saying, and I think that there are some interesting parallels between journalism and science in this misinformation era, where there's there's also maybe a perceived, at least, crisis of authenticity. I think all of this sort of plays together.
And I think it's changing in journalism, really, I do. I think there's like more and more journalists are sort of understanding that they can have an opinion and can sort of take a side, but they also have an obligation to be fair and report accurately. And you know, I teach journalism sometimes, and I will tell you that one of the biggest things I see with students is a strong resistance to sort of the thing that I came up learning, that neutrality, the neutrality. They don't want to do that at all. They want to write with an opinion, and they want to write from the I perspective. So I just think it is changing, and perhaps that is something for the better, at least with climate reporting, for sure. Okay, I think we're over. Well, I want to ask you one, do we have time for one more question? Does anybody know? There was a question about cat litter. Somebody reports on pets, and the question thing is now, there's something up, so somebody back there okay, here we go. So Daniel, I write about pets. You mentioned how important systemic changes are. Are there some systemic changes that could be made in pet owning that could contribute to solving the climate problem? Alternative cat litters or alternative proteins for pet foods or changes in manufacturing techniques? Do you know anything about that, Dr. Swain?
I can't say that I'm an expert in pet systems, but I think in a general sense, I think it kind of comes back to this idea that I think on some level, it's really worth focusing on the big things. And I love having a dog at home, so I don't think that the solution is to not have pets or to necessarily force animals to eat things that they really shouldn't be. So I don't really know. The answer is I don't know. But I guess that's the point, is that I don't know. Most of us don't know. Apparently, even folks who write about pets for their career don't necessarily know. And the point of that is that it is really difficult for us to be making those decisions on our own. Those kinds of day-to-day decisions on agonizing over what is which T-shirt is lower carbon than another T-shirt, or maybe the lower carbon T-shirt is made using forced labor, or maybe it's unethical for some other reason. So are you trading low carbon for something else that you don't want? And it's genuinely difficult to sort of see the big picture with a lot of things. And so I think what I would say is I don't know, and I think that tells us something about the importance of these large-scale changes, making it easier for people to make, expanding the range of choices and making it more obvious what is actually a good choice.
What I like about this question, though, is that I think it was Stacy who asked it. I'm not sure here now. Was it? Oh, it was Kim Thornton. What I like about this, though, is that this person is thinking about what can I do with what I write about? Yeah. Like, let me explore climate with what I write about, even if it's about, about pets, which is something that you wouldn't typically think you would think about climate. But it's the same way with race. I mean, every story is a race story, and every story now is also, I think, a climate story. Did you guys agree with that?
I think so, and I think one of the interesting things now in today's economy is that these things do touch on so many things, right? So maybe back in the day, you I don't know what you bought your dog a steak or something or whatever, and fed the dog, but now everything is coming through these systems, so they're an opportunity to talk about these trade-offs and these complexities and things. So yeah, I think it's great. I mean, we have, and that's an opportunity to talk about the whole health of the animal as well, the rabbit, the cat, the dog, or whatever. And I think there's all kinds of fun stuff that you can get doing there. And I would encourage you guys that are trying something new. I'm not sure what's going on here, to reach out to your local universities. So for example, our program has a year-long research requirement to graduate. UCLA has Symposium things, USC, Northridge, all these different places have these young people that can help you with some of your data visualizations, running down some of the things that might be very hard. If you're a pet person, you might not understand all the stuff that goes into the cat lid or whatever. But there are increasing venues where you can get free labor, or at least very, very cheap labor, to help you do some of this data pulling together exploration. And sometimes we scientists give the information to you guys. Sometimes you guys come to us and ask us, can you guys help us with this? And it should be a two-way street there, so it doesn't have to be a one-way street.
Do you think the best way for a journalist to get that sort of help would be to directly reach out to the professor, not go through the public affairs or public information?
I'd look up Professor blah, blah, blah and say, hey, do you know, and if he or she can't, they would almost surely put you off to whoever the person, I would go through the faculty, not the PR folks.
Okay.
Yeah, I would add that I do both. I get requests both ways, but 90 to 95% of them are direct requests from journalists.
Yeah. Okay, great. I think that our panel was supposed to go just until 11 unless they switched the time, because the time was a little different. Does anybody know? Oh, it does go to 11:15.
So much time.
Awesome. Okay, here we go. Does anyone out in the audience here have any questions for any of the panelists? Anyone have a question before?
We solved it all. The pets took it away.
Yeah.
That's great. Okay. I do have one thing that I wanted to ask. Do you have hope for California? I mean, I know Dr. Swain is in Colorado, but Dr. Anderson's here in Ventura County. I mean, what is your feeling? Do you think, I think Dr. Anderson shared with me previously a site where you can go and look at what the climate will be in 60 years or what the projected climate is. And I know, Dr. Swain, I think you do work in this area also. So what do you think? Any tips for us Californians who are super worried?
I'm actually optimistic, which sounds strange. So I think we heard earlier about the MWD's district of the June 1st only watering outdoors one day a week, and if we don't make that target of reduce to 30% consumption on average, by the end of summer we'll go to no watering outdoors. I think that's going to be massive. I think that's going to be really, really massive. In Southern Californians not having a green lawn, I think psychologically it's going to make it a very tangible thing that everybody is going to see, regardless of denial or.
So a wake-up call. You think?
I think the wake-up call is great, and I think we do have solutions. So if we talk about our home county of Ventura, we can do stuff, right? We can do stuff. So we have done things that didn't seem like they were going to happen. We have an ordinance called SOAR, Save Our Agricultural and Open Space Resources. That passed 25 years ago, was just renewed. We have the U.S.'s first wildlife corridor overlay for our county to regulate what type of buildings we can do in certain areas. Both of those, massive opposition. The vast majority of people said that's never going to happen. They've been implemented, and so I think when we have these crises, sometimes we get freaked out, and these websites that will tell us what the temperatures, what trajectory we're on to have this temperature or this environment, those are very real. Those aren't fake or whatever, but I'm optimistic that we will pull the ship up before we crash into the ground. The question is how close to the ground are we going to get? And that's a non-trivial thing, but I think we will. I think there's a huge groundswell, especially of younger folks, to do something tangible. And so I'm guardedly optimistic.
Larry, are you?
Oh, absolutely. In the terms of just the last half of century, if you think of all the innovations that have been created, so many of the world's contributions have all come from California. If you just look at the Silicon Valley.
You think we're going to solve our problems then?
Well, I think we're hopefully equipped to try to solve them.
Okay, Dr. Swain, it's your turn. You're on the hot seat.
Yeah, I mean, as a physical climate scientist, I often have this dissonance in my mind a lot of the time, which is sort of this and sometimes it's multiple times in the same day, in the same week. A certain level of pessimism, a certain level of optimism. I mean, on the one hand, You know, we are still moving in the wrong direction from a physical climate perspective, that we are still putting an increasing amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So for all the efforts we've done so far, the atmosphere doesn't know anything about them yet at all. It still thinks that we're doing business as usual. But we're not quite doing business as usual, and things have changed a lot in the past 5 years relative to the trajectory we were on before that. And we have probably ruled out some of the worst case warming scenarios that were on the table as recently as 5-7 years ago. So that's good. And I think the thing that gets to me is that I actually hear this a lot from young people, increasingly often in the past couple of years, a genuine sense of fear that the problem isn't solvable, even in an ideal world, that it is a physical impossibility to solve this problem. And the good news is that's not how we understand the problem from a physical perspective. This is actually a solvable problem. And it's not just some completely ridiculous thing we'd have to do to, you know, blow up the asteroid when it's, you know, just a moon's length away. No, this is really something that is actually a solvable problem still. We're not doing enough to solve it. So my pessimism comes from the political, practical side of, you know, it always is more difficult to make certain things happen than it should be. But my optimism actually is on the physical science side, believe it or not, which is that everything tells us this is still a solvable problem if we do the things that we know we need to do. And it's no mystery what it is we need to do. We just need to do them. So the we just need to do them part, it has a really big asterisk next to it. But this is not some kind of hypothetically unsolvable problem. There is not runaway warming occurring. The warming is not causing more warming in an uncontrollable fashion where it doesn't matter what we're doing. No, it really does matter. And all the evidence suggests that if we can bring our carbon emissions to zero, then we will halt global warming. So that's really what the physical science tells us. And that's both my motivation for optimism and pessimism at the same time, depending on the hour and the day.
Yeah, I get that. I think the big message to get out is really just educating people that, yeah, we can solve this. It is solvable. It's not, we don't have to give up. I mean, because I agree with you that so many people do believe that that's true, that, oh, it's way past the point where anything could change and we're just doomed. So
yeah, we're not past a point of no return.
Right.
Yet, you know, which is a language I hear a lot.
Yeah, we definitely are not. Definitely are not.
Which is a very good thing, and I guess we should just end on that note because we're at that time. I really appreciate your time, all three of you. I'm so happy that you were able to make it, and maybe you can join us next year too, and maybe we can all be in person and have a packed house, maybe. We'll see. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you, Dr. Swain.
Thank you.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Dr. Anderson.